People always ask me the same question after I tell them what happened. They want to know why I didn't call the police. I understand why they ask. If someone stood outside your house every night, you'd call the police too. The problem is, I did. More than once. By the time they finally believed something was wrong, it was already too late. This started 8 months ago. At the time, my life was painfully ordinary. I was 29. I worked remotely for a software company. My routine almost never changed. Wake up, work, order dinner, watch something until I fell asleep. Repeat. I'd lived in the same small suburban neighborhood for almost 3 years. It was the kind of place where everyone recognized each other's cars but rarely knew each other's names. Quiet, predictable, safe. Nothing strange had ever happened there. At least, not until the first night. I woke up suddenly, not slowly, not because of a dream. 1 second I was asleep. The next, I was sitting upright in bed. My digital clock read exactly 3:13 a.m. I stared at it for a moment before lying back down. I assumed I'd heard something outside. A car, a barking dog, maybe thunder. But the neighborhood was completely silent. I eventually fell back asleep and forgot about it by breakfast. The next night, it happened again. Exactly 3:13 a.m. This time I stayed awake for several minutes. Nothing. No sounds. No movement. Just silence. I remember laughing to myself. Our brains do strange things sometimes. I figured my body had simply decided that 3:13 was the perfect time to wake up. On the third night, everything changed. I woke up at exactly the same time. Only this time, I felt something. It wasn't fear. It was the unmistakable feeling that someone was looking at me. You know that sensation when you're certain you're being watched even before you see anyone? That's exactly what it felt like. I tried ignoring it, closed my eyes, counted backward. Nothing worked. The feeling only became stronger. Finally, I got out of bed. I walked to the bedroom window and pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. The street lights were still on. Everything looked normal. Parked cars, mailboxes, trees moving slightly in the wind. Then I noticed someone standing beneath the last street light at the end of my road. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, maybe someone waiting for a ride. But something felt wrong. They weren't checking a phone. They weren't smoking. They weren't pacing. They were perfectly still, facing my house. The distance made it impossible to see any details. All I could make out was a dark silhouette. Average height, average build, hands hanging at their sides, completely motionless. I watched for nearly 5 minutes. They never moved, not once. Eventually I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe they were waiting for someone. Maybe they were lost. I went back to bed. When I woke up that morning, the figure was gone. By lunchtime, I'd almost forgotten about it. The fourth night, I woke at 3:13 again. This time I didn't hesitate. I went straight to the window. The figure was still there. Except, it wasn't. Not really. It was closer. The previous night, they'd been standing beneath the last streetlight. Now they were standing beneath the next one. Exactly one house closer. I frowned. I actually walked to my living room window for a better angle. Same person. Same posture. Still facing my house. Still not moving. I checked the time. 3:14. They hadn't taken a single step. I stood there until nearly 4 in the morning. Nothing changed. When daylight came, they were gone again. I finally decided to call the non-emergency police line. I felt ridiculous doing it. What was I supposed to report? Someone standing on a public sidewalk? The officer who arrived later that afternoon was polite. He asked a few questions, walked around the property, looked at the spot where I'd seen the figure. He told me there wasn't much they could do unless the person trespassed or threatened me. He suggested installing security cameras. I thanked him. He left. That evening, I drove to an electronics store and bought 2 outdoor cameras. One faced the street. The other covered my front yard. I installed both before sunset. I remember feeling relieved. Finally, I'd know whether this person was actually showing up or whether I was imagining things. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking the time. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2, then 3:13. My eyes opened before the alarm on my phone could vibrate, almost as though my body had been expecting it. I didn't even look out the window first. I opened the security camera app. The live feed loaded instantly. The figure was there, standing one house closer than the night before. I switched to the recording timeline. The camera had been recording continuously since sunset. I dragged the timeline backward. 3 a.m. The figure was already there. 2 a.m. Still there. Midnight. Still there. 10 p.m. Still there. I kept dragging the timeline farther back. 8 p.m. The figure hadn't arrived. It had already been standing there, motionless, facing my house, the entire night. No walking, no approaching, no arrival, just there. I watched the footage 3 more times, not because I didn't believe it, because I couldn't. The person never entered the frame. They never crossed the street. They never appeared. The first frame of the recording already showed them standing beneath the streetlight, as though they'd been waiting there before the camera even started. I looked up from my phone and out the window. The figure hadn't moved. I glanced back at the recording, then back outside. Still nothing. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The live feed showed the figure looking directly at my bedroom window. I slowly lowered my phone. There was no way they could see me. My room was dark. I was standing behind the curtain. Yet somehow, it felt like they knew exactly where I was. I stepped away from the window, pulled the curtain shut, locked it even though it made no difference. Then I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I left every light in the house on, because for the first time in years, my home no longer felt like the safest place in the world. It felt like the place someone had been trying to find. I made a mistake the next morning. Instead of deleting the footage and trying to move on, I became obsessed with it. I watched the recording over and over again, looking for something I'd missed. A shadow, a reflection, a passing car. Anything that could explain how someone appeared on my street without ever walking into view. I found nothing. The figure simply existed for nearly 12 hours. Then daylight came and the camera showed an empty street. No moment where they left. No frame where they disappeared. One image showed the figure. The next image, the sidewalk was empty. The camera hadn't glitched. The timestamp never skipped. There was simply one frame with someone standing there, followed by another frame where they were gone. That should have terrified me. Instead, it convinced me there had to be a technical explanation. I contacted the camera manufacturer. I sent them the footage. A technician reviewed it and told me the recording looked completely normal. No corruption. No dropped frames. No signs of editing. According to him, the camera had captured exactly what happened. That answer didn't help. It only made things worse. That evening, I decided to stay awake. If the figure really appeared before midnight, I wanted to see it happen with my own eyes. I made coffee, turned on every light in the living room, placed my laptop on the coffee table with the security camera feeds open. By 11 o'clock, I was still wide awake. The street was empty. Midnight came. Nothing. 1 o'clock. Nothing. 2. Still nothing. I kept checking between the window and the live feed. The road remained deserted. At exactly 2:47 a.m., my internet disconnected. Only for a few seconds. The camera feeds froze. The loading icon spun. I cursed under my breath and refreshed the page. The connection returned almost immediately. The street appeared again. The figure was already there, standing beneath the next streetlight. One house closer. I looked out the window so quickly I nearly knocked over my coffee. The figure was there too, perfectly still. I checked my watch. Only a few seconds had passed. There was no way someone could have walked into position without me seeing them. I had been looking directly outside. The only thing I'd missed was the brief moment the cameras lost connection. I spent the next hour replaying those few seconds in my head. The outage couldn't have been a coincidence. It was the only gap I'd had all night. The next morning, I called my internet provider. They confirmed there had been no outage in my area. No interruptions. No maintenance. According to their records, my connection had remained active all night. I didn't argue. I simply thanked them and hung up. Later that afternoon, I walked down my street. I wanted to stand exactly where the figure had been. Maybe I'd noticed something. A footprint. A cigarette butt. Anything. There was nothing unusual about the sidewalk. Just cracked concrete and neatly trimmed lawns. As I stood beneath the streetlight, I looked toward my house. The view was unsettling. From that exact spot, my bedroom window was perfectly centered. Whoever the figure was, they hadn't been staring at my house. They'd been staring directly into my room. That realization stayed with me all day. That night, I borrowed a ladder from my neighbor and adjusted one of the cameras. Instead of facing the street, it now looked directly down from the roof. If the figure appeared again, I'd finally know how. Midnight came. Nothing. 1. Nothing. 2. Nothing. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I woke up. I sat up so quickly I almost fell out of bed. I stared at the clock. Oh, I'd stayed awake. I was certain I had. The last thing I remembered was checking my phone at 2:58. Now it was 3:13. 15 minutes had vanished. I rushed to the camera app. The rooftop camera had the perfect angle. I rewound the footage. At 2:58, the street was empty. At 2:59, the recording froze. Not the image. Time itself. The timestamp remained on 2:59 for exactly 14 minutes. The video continued playing. Trees moved in the wind. A cat crossed the road. Clouds drifted overhead. Everything moved normally, except the clock. Then, without warning, the timestamp jumped from 2:59 to 3:13. The figure was standing beneath the streetlight. One house closer. I replayed it again and again. The timestamp wasn't skipping. It was as though those 14 minutes had never existed. Like time itself had been removed from the recording. I zoomed in on the figure. The image became grainy, blurry, almost useless, but one detail remained clear. Their clothes never changed. Night after night. Same dark coat. Same posture. Same arms hanging at their sides. Then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The figure wasn't facing my house anymore. It was facing the camera. Not the street. Not my bedroom. The camera. As if it knew exactly where I'd moved it. I slowly looked up from my phone. The silhouette stood across the street. Motionless. Even from that distance, I had the overwhelming feeling it was smiling. I couldn't actually see a smile. It was too dark. Too far away. But every instinct I had screamed the same thing. It knew I was watching. And somehow, it wanted me to keep watching. I closed every curtain in the house. Unplugged both cameras. Turned off every light. I told myself I was done. No more recordings. No more checking the window. No more feeding whatever this was with my attention. I honestly believed that ignoring it would make it stop. The next morning, I found a printed photograph lying on my front doorstep. There was no envelope, no note, no fingerprints, just a single glossy photograph. It showed my house, taken from the exact spot where the figure had been standing the night before. Only one thing was different. In the upstairs bedroom window, someone was looking back. It wasn't the figure. It was me, standing behind the curtain. The photograph had been taken from outside, but I'd never opened the curtain that night. I was absolutely certain of that. Then I looked closer. The timestamp printed in the corner of the photograph read, "Tomorrow." The photograph stayed on my kitchen table for 3 days. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I couldn't stop looking at it either. Every time I passed it, my eyes drifted to the timestamp. Tomorrow. The date had finally become today. Nothing happened. At least, nothing obvious. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it bothered me even more. If whoever took the picture could predict tomorrow, why hadn't tomorrow happened? Or maybe it already had. Maybe I just hadn't noticed. That afternoon I did something I should have done much sooner. I knocked on my neighbors' doors. Not to tell them everything. Just enough to see if they'd noticed someone standing outside every night. The first few conversations went exactly how you'd expect. Most people hadn't seen anything. Some apologized and promised they'd keep an eye out. One elderly woman smiled politely before saying she'd been asleep by 9 every night for the last 20 years. Then I reached the last house on the street. The one closest to where I'd first seen the figure. An old man answered after several knocks. He looked to be in his 70s. Thin, gray hair, a cane in one hand. The moment he saw my face, his smile disappeared. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask what I wanted. Instead, he asked, "How many houses away is it now?" I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't mentioned anyone. I quietly asked what he meant. He looked over my shoulder toward my house, then back at me. "Closer every night?" I couldn't speak. He sighed, almost sadly. I was hoping it skipped this generation. Before I could ask another question, he closed the door. Not slammed, just closed it. I knocked again. No answer. Again. Nothing. I waited almost 5 minutes before giving up. As I walked back toward my driveway, I noticed his curtains move. He was still watching me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. How many houses away is it now? He hadn't asked if I'd seen someone. He already knew, which meant one of two things. Either he'd experienced this himself, or someone close to him had. At exactly 3:13, I woke again. The figure had moved another house closer, but something was different. For the first time, its head wasn't facing my bedroom. It was turned slightly, toward the old man's house, as if it had been watching him instead. Only for a moment. Then, it slowly turned back toward me. I shut the curtain immediately. The next morning, the old man's house was empty. Not abandoned. Empty. The mailbox had been removed. The curtains were gone. The porch furniture had vanished. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. I actually questioned whether I'd gone to the wrong house. Until another neighbor walked by. I asked what had happened to the man who lived there. She frowned. "What man?" "The older gentleman." She looked genuinely confused. "That house has been vacant since I moved here." "When did you move here?" She thought for a second. 11 years ago. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I'd spoken to him yesterday. She watched my expression change and asked if I was feeling all right. I lied. Said I must have mixed up the address. She smiled and continued walking. I stood there for almost 10 minutes, staring at the empty porch, trying to remember every detail of the conversation. The cane, the wrinkles, the way he'd looked past me instead of at me. It had happened. I knew it had. So why did no one else remember him? That afternoon I searched county property records. The house had indeed been empty. For 12 years. No electricity. No water usage. No owner listed after the previous resident disappeared. Disappeared. That word caught my attention. I requested the archived records. The clerk looked surprised. Apparently no one had asked for them in years. An hour later she returned with a dusty folder. Inside was a missing persons report. Harold Mercer, age 73. Last seen leaving his home. No witnesses. No evidence. No body. Estimated disappearance? 12 years ago. Attached to the report was a photograph. My blood ran cold. It was him. The man I'd spoken to yesterday. The exact same face. The same clothes. The same cane. The photograph had been taken 12 years earlier. I turned the page. There was one final document in the folder. A handwritten statement from the detective assigned to the case. It wasn't filed as evidence. Someone had crossed it out in red ink. The detective claimed Mr. Mercer had repeatedly reported waking at exactly 3:13 a.m. He insisted someone stood outside his house every night. Moving closer. The report ended with one sentence. Subject became increasingly convinced the figure was waiting to replace him. Below that, someone had written in different handwriting. Case closed. Subject suffered a psychological break. I stared at those words. They felt manufactured, too convenient, as if someone wanted the case forgotten. When I arrived home, another photograph was waiting on my doorstep. This one wasn't of my house. It showed the old man's front porch, taken only a few feet away. Standing in the doorway was Harold Mercer, looking directly into the camera. Behind him, inside the dark hallway, stood the motionless figure, closer than it had ever been before. The timestamp in the corner didn't say tomorrow. It didn't say today. Simply read, 12 years ago. I couldn't stop thinking about Harold Mercer. Not because he'd disappeared. People disappear every day. It was because I'd spoken to him. I'd shaken his hand. I'd heard his voice. Yet every official record insisted he'd vanished 12 years ago. One of us had to be wrong. I was starting to hope it was me. The detective's statement stayed in my mind. Subject became increasingly convinced the figure was waiting to replace him. Those weren't the words of someone inventing a ghost story. They sounded like the notes of someone who had watched another person's sanity unravel. But there was something else. The report ended too neatly, almost as if someone had decided the explanation before asking the questions. I needed to know who had investigated Harold's disappearance. 2 days later, I visited the county archives. The building smelled like old paper and dust. Rows of gray filing cabinets stretched farther than I expected. A woman behind the desk asked what I was looking for. I told her I wanted records relating to a missing person from 12 years ago. She typed for a few seconds, then frowned. She said something strange. There should be 3 boxes. She looked again. Only one is here. I asked what happened to the others. She shrugged. No idea. They've simply vanished. The remaining box contained newspaper clippings. Most were ordinary. Local man disappears. Search enters 3rd week. Police find no evidence of foul play. Then I found an article that had never been published. Across the top, someone had stamped it in red. Withheld. The journalist claimed several residents had reported seeing someone standing outside their homes at exactly 3:13 a.m. during the weeks before Harold vanished. Every witness described the same thing. A motionless silhouette, moving one house closer each night. The editor had written a note in the margin. This sounds insane. Find better sources. The article was never printed. Near the bottom of the box was something wrapped in brown paper. No label. No inventory number. Inside was a small black notebook. The first page read, "Property of Harold Mercer." My pulse quickened. It wasn't a diary. It was more like an investigation. Every page contained dates, sketches, measurements, maps of the neighborhood. Harold hadn't been hiding from the figure. He'd been studying it. The first entries matched my own experience almost perfectly. Night 1. Woke at 3:13. Saw someone beneath the last streetlight. Thought nothing of it. Night 4. Closer. Police uninterested. Installed cameras. Night 8. No arrival. No departure. Impossible footage. Every page felt like reading my own future. Then the entries began changing. They described things I hadn't experienced. Not yet. Night 11. Do not speak to the figure even if it speaks first. I frowned. Mine had never spoken. Night 14. The neighbors are changing. They remember different things every morning. Night 17. The houses are no longer in the same order. I actually laughed. That one was impossible. Until I looked out the archive window. Across the street, the coffee shop I'd passed on the way in was gone. In its place stood a pharmacy. I blinked, looked away, looked back. The coffee shop was there again. I rubbed my eyes. Sleep deprivation. That had to be it. The notebook continued. Each entry became more frantic. The handwriting grew shaky. Words were crossed out. Entire pages had been torn away. Then I reached a section that made my stomach twist. Harold had drawn a map of the neighborhood. Every night, he updated the figure's position. Exactly one house closer, just like mine. But there was another mark, a second red dot, moving too, not toward the houses, toward Harold, from the opposite direction. He'd written one sentence beneath the map. I kept watching the figure. I never noticed something else was watching me. I stared at the page. What did that mean? There was only one figure. Wasn't there? The final pages had been ripped out. Every one except the very last. Only 6 words remained. Written so hard the pen had almost torn through the paper. Don't let it reach the porch. No explanation. No context. Just those words. I took the notebook home. I know I shouldn't have. But something told me no one else had ever read it. That night, I placed Harold's notebook beside my bed. At exactly 3:13 a.m. I woke. I didn't need to look outside. I already knew the figure would be closer. Instead, I looked at the notebook. It was open. I was certain I'd left it closed. A page I hadn't seen before was lying flat. Fresh ink covered the paper. Not faded. Not 12 years old. Fresh. The handwriting matched Harold's. Read, "You finally found my journal. Good. Now stop reading it. It knows when someone reaches this page." I heard something outside. Not footsteps. Not knocking. The slow, metallic scraping. Like someone dragging their fingernails across the mailbox at the end of my driveway. I pulled back the curtain. The figure had moved again. It wasn't standing beneath a streetlight anymore. It was standing at the entrance to my driveway, closer than ever before. And for the first time, its head wasn't lowered. It was looking directly at my bedroom. I couldn't see its face, but I knew, with absolute certainty, it was smiling. I didn't sleep again after seeing the figure at my driveway. I stayed by the bedroom window until sunrise. The moment the first rays of sunlight reached the street, it disappeared. Not by walking away. Not by fading into the darkness. 1 second it was standing there. The next, the driveway was empty. Exactly like every other morning. If someone had asked me then what frightened me the most, I would have said the figure. Looking back now, I was wrong. The figure wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that my neighborhood was slowly becoming unfamiliar. It started with little things. Things most people wouldn't even notice. A mailbox on the wrong side of the road. A stop sign that hadn't existed the day before. A large oak tree that suddenly disappeared. I convinced myself I simply hadn't been paying attention. People overlook details all the time. That's normal. Except, it kept happening. Every single day. One afternoon, I walked to the small convenience store 3 blocks away. I'd been there hundreds of times. I knew the route by memory. Halfway there, I stopped. There was a playground. Brand new. Bright blue swings. Fresh paint. Children laughing. The problem was, that playground had never been there. There used to be an empty parking lot. I stood there for several minutes trying to remember. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe it really had always been there. A young mother pushing a stroller noticed me staring. She smiled. "Beautiful park, isn't it?" I nodded slowly. "When did they build it?" She laughed. "It's been here since before my daughter was born." The little girl couldn't have been older than 6. I thanked her and continued walking. But I couldn't stop looking back. I knew that parking lot. I'd parked there dozens of times. Now, it had never existed. That night I searched through old photos on my phone. Vacation pictures. Holiday gatherings. Random photos of sunsets. Eventually I found what I was looking for. A picture I'd taken from the convenience store parking lot almost 2 years earlier. I zoomed in. The playground wasn't there. Just cracked asphalt. Faded parking lines. Exactly as I remembered. Relieved, I closed the photo. Then my phone vibrated. The image refreshed. The parking lot was gone. The playground stood in its place. Even the children were there. Frozen in the exact same positions I'd seen earlier that day. I checked the photo details. The timestamp hadn't changed. Neither had the location. Only the picture itself. I dropped the phone. I picked it back up a few moments later. The playground remained. There wasn't a trace of the parking lot anymore. It was as though reality had quietly edited itself. And only I remembered the original version. That evening, I returned to Harold's notebook. This time, I read every page carefully. Not just the entries, the margins, the tiny notes squeezed between paragraphs. Harold had written things he clearly hadn't wanted anyone else to notice. One sentence appeared over and over. "The street remembers before people do." At first I thought it was meaningless. Then I realized the neighborhood had been changing before the people living in it changed their memories. Reality wasn't rewriting everything at once. It was spreading, like cracks moving through glass. Near the back of the notebook, I found a folded map. It wasn't a map of the town, only my street. Every house had been numbered. Most of the numbers were crossed out. Beside house 3, Harold had written, "Owner no longer remembers me." House 5. Family insists they've lived there 30 years. They moved in last spring. House 8. Photographs changing. House 11. Do not trust the clocks. The final note had been circled so many times the paper had almost torn. House 14. Never knock after night 21. I looked up. My house was house 14. For almost an hour I sat staring at the map. 21 nights. Why that number? Why not 28? Why not the final night? Something happened before the countdown ended. Something Harold never explained. The next morning I decided to test something. I visited my next-door neighbor, Melissa. We'd spoken dozens of times over the years. Nothing more than small talk. Still, she knew me, or at least she should have. She answered the door with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" I smiled back. "I just wanted to ask if you've noticed anyone standing outside at night." She looked confused. "I'm sorry. I don't think we've met." I laughed. "Melissa, it's me." Her expression didn't change. "I think you have the wrong house." My stomach tightened. "You borrowed my ladder 3 months ago." She shook her head. "I've never borrowed a ladder. You have a golden retriever named Max. I don't own a dog." I looked past her into the living room. A large gray cat jumped onto the couch. There had always been a dog. Always. She noticed where I was looking. "Oh, you mean Oliver?" She picked up the cat. "He hates strangers." I apologized and walked away. Halfway down the driveway I turned around. The family portrait hanging beside her front door had changed. I'd seen that picture countless times. It used to show Melissa, her husband, and a little boy. Now, there were 2 little girls. No boy. No empty space where someone had been edited out. Just a completely different family. I hurried home and opened my laptop. I searched Melissa's social media. Every photo showed 2 daughters. Every birthday post, every Christmas, every vacation. The son I remembered had never existed. I checked my own photos. The barbecue we'd hosted last summer. Melissa had brought brownies. Her son had spent the entire afternoon throwing a tennis ball for Max. I found the picture, then watched it change. The little boy slowly disappeared. The dog faded away. The tennis ball rolled across the grass by itself. A little girl appeared beside Melissa instead, as if she'd always been there. I slammed the laptop shut. I finally understood what Harold meant. The street wasn't changing. History was. That evening, I drove back to the county archives. The elderly woman at the front desk recognized me immediately. "You forgot something yesterday." She reached beneath the counter, then placed another notebook in front of me, smaller than Harold's, bound in dark green leather. I frowned. "I've never seen this before." She looked puzzled. "Yes, you have. You checked it out last week." "I wasn't here last week." She stared at me for several uncomfortable seconds, then quietly asked, "Are you sure?" I looked at the checkout slip attached to the inside cover. There, written in my own handwriting, was my name, my signature, and a date, 7 days earlier, a week before I'd ever discovered Harold's journal. The librarian leaned closer. "I remember because you asked me a strange question." "What question?" She hesitated, then repeated my exact words. "You asked, when I come back next week, will you still remember me?" A cold chill spread through my body. I had no memory of saying that. No memory of visiting. No memory of the notebook. I slowly opened it. The first page was completely blank, except for one sentence, written in handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar. Not Harold's. Mine. Read, "You're already forgetting." I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I heard the old librarian whisper something so quietly I almost missed it. "I don't think you have much time left." I looked up. "What do you mean?" She frowned. "As long as you still remember asking me that question." She paused. "You're still the original." Those words stayed with me all the way home, because she hadn't said, "If you forget." She'd said, "As long as you remember," as if forgetting wasn't something that might happen. It was something that already had. More than once. I barely slept after leaving the archives. The old librarian's words kept repeating in my head. As long as you still remember. Not if. As long as. She had spoken as if forgetting wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed unfamiliar. Every intersection looked slightly different. Twice I almost turned onto the wrong street. I blamed exhaustion. I wanted to blame exhaustion. But deep down, I knew something was changing again. When I pulled into my driveway, I immediately noticed something strange. My mailbox had moved. Not by much. Maybe 3 feet. Close enough that most people would never notice. Except, I'd installed that mailbox myself. I knew exactly where the post had been buried. There had even been a patch of dead grass around the concrete base. Now, the dead grass surrounded a different spot, as though the mailbox had always stood there. I walked over and touched it. The concrete looked old, weathered, not recently moved. It had aged with the rest of the yard. I backed away slowly. The street wasn't changing overnight anymore. It was changing while I watched. Inside the house, I spread everything across the dining room table. Harold's notebook, the photographs, the police reports, the property records. I began arranging them by date. Something bothered me. Harold had lived here 12 years ago. Yet none of his notes explained how the nightmare began. His journal started on night 1, just like mine. Nothing before that. No explanation. No trigger. It was almost as if everyone started at the same place, like the first chapter of a book that had already been written. I returned to Harold's map. This time I noticed something I'd missed before. In the corner, hidden beneath layers of pencil marks, was a small address. Not my house. Not any house on my street. It belonged to an abandoned property nearly 20 miles away. Beside the address, Harold had written only 3 words. It started here. The next morning I drove there. The road narrowed the farther I traveled. Eventually the pavement turned to gravel. Trees crowded both sides. Phone signal disappeared. GPS stopped updating. After another 10 minutes, I found the address. An old farmhouse. Or at least, what had once been one. The roof had partially collapsed. Windows were boarded shut. Weeds reached almost to my waist. It looked abandoned for decades. Yet, the front gate hung open. I almost turned around. Everything about the place felt wrong. Not haunted. Not dangerous. Wrong. Like seeing a familiar face with the eyes slightly too far apart. Small details that refused to fit together. The front porch had 5 steps. From one angle. 6 from another. The windows seemed different sizes every time I looked away. Even the shadows didn't stay where they should. I kept telling myself it was perspective. But perspective doesn't change while you're standing still. The front door opened with almost no effort. Inside, dust covered everything. Old furniture remained exactly where someone had left it. A coffee mug still sat on a side table. A newspaper rested beside an armchair. I looked closer. The date made me stop breathing. July 18th. This year. Yesterday. Impossible. The paper wasn't faded. It wasn't yellow. It looked as though someone had been reading it only hours earlier. I searched the rest of the house. Every room was empty, until I reached the 2nd floor. There, at the end of a narrow hallway, stood a single wooden door. Unlike everything else in the house, it looked new. The wood was smooth. The brass handle shined. No dust. No scratches. Nothing. As if someone polished it every day. I reached for the handle, then froze. 3 slow knocks echoed from the other side. Knock. 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 Exactly the same rhythm I'd heard inside my own wall. I stepped backward. The knocking stopped. Then a voice came through the door. Not loud. Barely above a whisper. It sounded exactly like mine. It said only one sentence. Don't open it this time. Every muscle in my body locked. I hadn't told anyone about the voice, because until that moment, there hadn't been one. I ran. I don't remember reaching my car. I only remember locking the doors and driving until I reached the highway. Only then did I notice something sitting in the passenger seat. Harold's notebook. I was certain I'd left it on the dining room table. Yet there it was, open. A page fluttered in the wind from the air conditioner. New writing covered the paper. Fresh ink. Not there before. Read. You opened the farmhouse on your second cycle. You opened it again on your fifth. You've opened it 9 times. This is the first time you've listened. I nearly drove off the road. Second cycle. Fifth? Ninth? There had only been one. Hadn't there? That night I searched every inch of my house again. Not for the figure. For evidence that I'd forgotten something. I checked old receipts, calendars, medical records, family photos. Everything looked normal. Until I found my passport. The issue date was impossible. It had been renewed 8 years ago. I clearly remembered standing in line at the passport office, waiting for hours, complaining about the paperwork. Except, the passport had been issued in another state, one I'd never visited. There was even a different signature. Mine. But not mine. The more I searched, the more impossible details I found. A receipt from a restaurant I didn't remember visiting. A photograph from a hiking trail I'd never seen. A hotel key card from another city. Tiny pieces of a life that belonged to me, and didn't. Around midnight, I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow. Measured. Not creaking floorboards. Actual footsteps. One after another. Crossing the hallway above my living room. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs. Every room was empty. The footsteps stopped. Then, I noticed something. The hallway felt longer. Not by inches. By several feet. The distance from my bedroom to the bathroom had changed. I knew because I'd walked it thousands of times. Tonight, it took 18 steps. Yesterday, it had taken 12. At the far end of the hallway, where there should have been only a wall, stood a door. Wooden. Paint peeling away with age. I had lived in this house for 6 years. That door had never existed. Carved into the wood were 3 familiar words. Do not open. I reached toward the handle, then stopped, because I finally understood something. The warning wasn't written for me. It was written by me. I stood in the hallway for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the door. It didn't belong there. I knew every inch of this house. I'd painted these walls, installed the light fixtures, replaced the flooring. There had never been a door at the end of the hallway. Yet here it was. Scratch. Faded white paint peeling from the wood. The brass handle was worn smooth as though thousands of hands had turned it over the years. Carved into the center were the same words I'd seen at the abandoned farmhouse. Do not open. I reached toward the handle, then stopped. Not because I was afraid, because something finally occurred to me. If the warning was meant to keep something inside, why was it written on my side of the door? I stepped back and examined the wall. The paint around the frame was seamless. No fresh plaster. No cracks. No evidence that the door had ever been added. It looked older than the house itself. I walked downstairs and found the original blueprints in a storage box. According to every floor plan, the hallway ended in a wall. There was no door. No room beyond it. Nothing. I returned upstairs. The door was still there. Waiting. I decided not to open it. Instead, I wedged a chair beneath the handle. Not because I thought it would stop anything. Because I wanted proof. If the chair moved overnight, I'd know the door wasn't just another hallucination. Then I went downstairs, made coffee, turned on every light in the house. I refused to sleep. Not tonight. At exactly 3:13 a.m., every light went out. Not just in my house. Outside too. The entire neighborhood disappeared into darkness. Only one light remained. A thin line of warm yellow beneath the mysterious door upstairs. Someone was inside. I listened carefully. At first, nothing. Then, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Crossing the room behind the door. Back and forth. Back and forth. As if someone were pacing. Waiting. The footsteps stopped. 3 soft knocks came from the other side. Knock. 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 I didn't answer. Several seconds passed. Then a voice. My voice. Come. Tired. Older somehow. You ignored me at the farmhouse. Silence. I hoped you would. Another pause. But I knew you'd come here instead. Every instinct told me to run. Instead, I asked the question that had been haunting me for days. Who are you? The answer came immediately. I'm what's left. The lights flickered back on. Everything became quiet. The line of light beneath the door vanished. I rushed upstairs. The chair was still wedged beneath the handle, untouched. Nothing had moved. Yet, when I placed my hand on the wood, it felt warm, as though someone had been standing on the other side only seconds earlier. The next morning, I drove back to the county archives. I needed answers. The elderly librarian wasn't surprised to see me. She looked disappointed. You found the door. It wasn't a question. You knew. She nodded slowly. I was hoping you wouldn't. I sat across from her. Tell me what it is. She was silent for a long time. Finally, she stood up and disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she carried a large leather binder. The cover had no title, only a number. She placed it on the table between us. Read carefully. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Each one showed a different person, different decades, different clothes, different houses. Yet every photograph had one thing in common. Someone was standing outside at exactly 3:13 a.m., watching. The earliest photograph was black and white. The latest couldn't have been more than a year old. Every person had eventually disappeared, or so the records claimed. Then I noticed another pattern. Each file contained exactly 28 photographs. Never 27, never 29, always 28. One for every night. Near the back of the binder was a page filled with names. There were dozens. Each had a date beside it. Some stretched back more than a century. I scanned the list until my heart nearly stopped. The final entry hadn't been completed. Only the name had been written. What? The date was blank, as though someone was waiting to fill it in. I looked up. Who writes these? The librarian didn't answer. Instead, she asked me something strange. What did the voice behind the door say? I hesitated, then repeated it exactly. I'm what's left. She closed her eyes, almost like she'd expected that answer. Then she whispered something I barely heard. It remembers you. What remembers me? The house. I laughed, not because it was funny, because I couldn't think of anything else to do. A house can't remember people. It isn't remembering people. She looked directly into my eyes. It's remembering versions. I stared at her. She continued. Every time the cycle ends, it keeps a copy. I felt my pulse quicken. A copy of what? She looked toward the window, then back at me. You. I drove home in silence. The binder lay on the passenger seat. I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to disappear. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my front door was open. I was certain I'd locked it. Every light inside the house was on. The television was playing static. A faucet was running somewhere upstairs. I slowly stepped inside. Hello? No answer. I searched every room. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. No missing valuables. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Except the chair I'd wedged beneath the mysterious door. It wasn't there anymore. It was lying neatly against the hallway wall, folded, as though someone had politely moved it out of the way. The door itself was slightly open, just enough for darkness to spill into the hallway. Not ordinary darkness, a darkness that looked deeper, like looking into a room where the light itself had been removed. I stood frozen. Then I noticed something on the floor, a trail of muddy footprints. They began inside the room, crossed the hallway, went down the stairs, through the living room, and stopped at the front door. Whoever had come out had left the house, but there was no second set of footprints, nothing leading back inside. Only one person had walked out. I followed the prints with my eyes until they disappeared onto the front porch. Then I looked down. The mud hadn't fully dried yet. Whoever made them couldn't have left more than a few minutes earlier. I slowly stepped onto the porch. The street was empty, completely silent. Then, almost at the end of the block, I saw someone turn the corner. Just for a second. The same height as me. The same jacket I was wearing. Walking away. Not toward my house. Away from it. For the first time since this nightmare began, the figure wasn't standing still. It was leaving. And somehow, that terrified me far more. I don't remember deciding to follow him. One moment I was standing on my porch. The next I was running. The muddy footprints had disappeared at the sidewalk. There were no tire marks. No fresh footprints. Nothing. Yet I knew exactly which direction he'd gone. Not because I'd seen him. Because something inside me recognized the path. The neighborhood looked different at night. Not darker. Quieter. Almost abandoned. Every house had its lights off. No televisions. No barking dogs. No music. The entire street felt frozen. The only sound was my own breathing. Then, I saw him again. Halfway down the block. Walking at the exact same pace. Never speeding up. Never slowing down. Always just far enough away that I couldn't catch him. I called out. Stop. He didn't even turn his head. I kept chasing him for nearly 10 minutes. Or at least, it felt like 10 minutes. Eventually I noticed something strange. I passed the same blue pickup truck 3 different times. The same broken street light. The same bicycle lying beside a driveway. I wasn't leaving the neighborhood. I was moving through it, without actually getting anywhere. It was like walking on a treadmill. The scenery repeated itself. Again, and again, and again. Finally the man stopped. He stood beneath a flickering street light. His back was toward me. I slowly approached. Every instinct screamed at me not to get closer. But curiosity had become stronger than fear. When I was only a few feet away, he spoke. You shouldn't have followed me. It was my voice. Exactly my voice. I swallowed hard. Turn around. He didn't. Instead he asked, do you remember your 8th birthday? I frowned. What? Your 8th birthday. I tried to answer. I couldn't. I remembered the house I grew up in. I remembered my parents. I remembered going to school. But my 8th birthday was gone. Completely blank. He continued. What about your high school graduation? Another blank. What did you eat yesterday morning? Nothing. The memories weren't faded. They simply weren't there. I know what you're thinking, he said. You think you're forgetting. He finally turned around. It was me. Not almost me. Exactly me. Every wrinkle. Every scar. Every tiny detail. Except, he looked older. Not by years. By exhaustion. Like someone who hadn't truly slept in decades. I've watched you ask those same questions before. My mouth went dry. What are you? He smiled sadly. I asked the same thing. Before I could respond, he reached into his jacket and handed me a photograph. Unlike the others, this one wasn't taken outside. It showed a small bedroom. A little boy sat on the edge of the bed. His back faced the camera. Someone stood in the doorway watching him sleep. I turned the photograph over. The date made my stomach twist. It was 20 years old. The little boy was me. I stared at him. I don't remember this. I know. Who took the picture? You did. I laughed. I was 8. You weren't the one holding the camera. The words settled over me like ice water. I looked back at the photograph. The person standing in the doorway wasn't visible. Only their shadow. Long. So. Watching. Exactly like the figure outside my house. It hadn't started a few weeks ago. It had been there. My entire life. I don't understand. You aren't supposed to. He stepped closer. You think this started when you saw someone outside your window? It didn't. It started the first time you noticed them. What do you mean? They've always been there. I felt my pulse racing. No. Children see them. They just forget. I wanted to argue. Then, a memory surfaced. Not clearly. Just fragments. A bedroom. A storm outside. Me hiding beneath my blanket. Looking toward the bedroom door. Someone standing there. Perfectly still. Watching. I'd always assumed it was a nightmare. Now, I wasn't so sure. You remembered. He He sounded almost relieved. It doesn't happen often. I looked at him. Who are they? For the first time, his expression changed. Fear. Real fear. I don't know. You don't know? I stopped trying to find out. Why? Because everyone who does. He looked past me. Meets them. I slowly turned around. At first, the street looked empty. Then my eyes adjusted. People. Standing in every front yard. Perfectly motionless. Not one. Not 10. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. One outside every house. Watching. None of them looked at the homes. Every single one was looking at me. I stepped backward. So they followed us? He shook his head. No. We built our houses around them. I stared. What? He pointed toward the oldest home on the street. Look carefully. I did. The foundation looked newer than the stone beneath it. The house wasn't built on empty land. It had been built around something, around someone, around the place where a figure had already been standing. The neighborhood hadn't attracted them. The neighborhood had hidden them. I don't believe you. I didn't either. He handed me another photograph. This one showed the construction of my neighborhood decades earlier. Workers, cranes, concrete. In the middle of the empty field, before a single house existed, stood one lone figure, exactly where my bedroom would eventually be built. Watching, waiting, motionless, long before anyone lived there. I looked up. He was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just gone. Only the photograph remained in my hands. Then something behind me whispered, very quietly, "You weren't supposed to meet your copy yet." I turned so fast I almost fell. Nobody. The street was empty again. Every watcher had vanished. Every porch. Every driveway. Nothing. Except, at the end of the road, there was one house I'd never seen before. It wasn't old. It wasn't abandoned. It looked exactly like mine. Same mailbox. Same porch swing. Same cracked driveway. Even the same light glowing in the upstairs bedroom. I knew that house didn't exist, because it was standing where the road ended, where there had always been nothing but woods. The front door slowly opened. Someone stepped outside. He looked exactly like me, but he wasn't looking at the strange house. He was looking directly at mine. Then he began walking, one house closer. I stood in the middle of the road for what felt like an hour. The impossible house was gone. The woods had returned. The dead end looked exactly as it always had. If I hadn't been holding the photograph, I would have convinced myself none of it had happened. I looked down. The picture was changing. Not fading. Changing. The construction workers slowly disappeared one by one. The cranes vanished. The unfinished roads crumbled away. Within seconds, the photograph showed only an empty field. In the center, the motionless figure remained. Everything else had changed. It hadn't. I drove home without remembering the trip. When I reached my driveway, something immediately felt wrong. The porch light was on. I never left it on. I distinctly remembered switching it off before chasing the man who looked like me. Now it glowed softly against the front steps. I unlocked the door. The television was playing. A documentary narrated by a voice I recognized. Mine. Not similar. Mine. The remote rested neatly on the coffee table. I had never turned it on. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee. A mug sat beside the sink. Steam still rose from it. I touched the handle. Warm. Someone had been here minutes earlier. The strange thing wasn't that someone had entered my house. It was that they behaved exactly the way I would have. The mug I always used. The exact amount of sugar. Even the spoon rested on the right side of the cup. Tiny habits no stranger could know. Then I noticed something hanging on the refrigerator. A grocery list, written in my handwriting. Milk, bread, coffee filters, light bulbs, batteries. At the bottom, one item had been added later. Don't forget the basement. I stared at the words. My house didn't have a basement. At least, I didn't think it did. I searched every room, every closet, every hallway. Nothing. No basement door. No stairs. I checked the original floor plans again. No basement. Then I remembered something Harold had written. The street remembers before people do. Maybe the house remembered too. I walked through the kitchen one more time, slowly, running my fingers across every wall, every cabinet, every shelf. Then I heard it, a hollow sound beneath the pantry floor. I knelt down. One of the floorboards was slightly darker than the others. I pressed it. Nothing. Pressed again. A quiet click echoed beneath my feet. The pantry shelves shifted. Not much. Just enough to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I froze. The staircase shouldn't exist. The blueprints insisted it didn't. Yet there it was. Old wooden steps disappearing beneath the house. A cold draft drifted upward. It smelled like damp earth, and something older, like paper that had been sealed away for decades. I grabbed a flashlight. Every step creaked beneath my weight. The farther I descended, the colder the air became. Eventually the stairs ended. The room below wasn't large, maybe 20 feet across. Stone walls, concrete floor, shelves lining every side, hundreds of cardboard boxes, each one carefully labeled, not with years, with names. I swept the flashlight across them. Harold Mercer, Evelyn Carter, Daniel Ross, names I'd never heard before. Then, one box stopped me. Omar. My own first name, written in faded black ink. Dust covered everything else. Not this box. Looked recent, as though someone had placed it there only yesterday. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of objects. My elementary school report cards. The toy car I'd lost when I was 9. My first driver's license. Birthday cards. Photographs. Concert tickets. Receipts. Pieces of my life. Things I'd forgotten years ago. Things I'd assumed had been thrown away. They were all here. Carefully organized. Cataloged. Preserved. As if someone had been collecting me. At the bottom lay a VHS tape. Across the label someone had written, Cycle 3. I frowned. 3? There had only been one cycle. Hadn't there? I searched the room until I found an old television sitting beneath a dusty blanket. Beside it, a VCR. It shouldn't have worked, but when I plugged it in, the screen flickered to life. Static filled the room. Then, the tape began playing. The recording showed my living room. The furniture looked older. Different wallpaper, a different couch, but it was unquestionably my house. The timestamp read, October 14th, 19 years earlier. A man entered the frame. For a second I thought it was my father. Then he turned toward the camera. It was me. Older, tired, exactly like the man I'd chased through the neighborhood. He looked directly into the lens. I don't know which cycle you're watching this from. If this tape still exists. Then I failed again. He sighed deeply. I've spent years trying to understand what this place is. I've been wrong every time. He reached toward something off camera, then placed an enormous map across the table. It wasn't just my street. It was the entire town. Every neighborhood, every school, every park. Hundreds of red circles covered it, each marked with a date, each dated decades apart. I thought this only happened here. It doesn't. I've found 73 neighborhoods. Maybe there are more. My breathing stopped. 73? That wasn't a haunting. It wasn't a curse. It was something much bigger. The older version of me continued. They're connected. I still don't know how. But every 28 nights, someone changes places. I've confirmed it. I've watched it happen. He looked exhausted. His eyes drifted toward something behind the camera. For the first time, fear crossed his face. There early, the lights in the recording flickered. He whispered one final sentence. If you ever find the room beneath the house, do not let them know you remember. The screen filled with static. Then, for a single frame, someone stood behind him. Not a copy, not a silhouette, something much taller. Its head almost touched the ceiling. Its arms were impossibly long. Its face was completely smooth. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just pale skin stretched over a featureless head. The tape ended. The room fell silent. I rewound the final seconds, frame by frame. The creature wasn't standing behind him. It was standing behind the camera, watching whoever was watching the tape. I slowly lowered the remote. Every instinct told me not to turn around. Then, I heard breathing. Not from the television. Not from upstairs. From somewhere inside the basement. Very close. Someone, or something, had been watching the tape with me the entire time. I switched off the flashlight. The room disappeared into darkness. For one terrifying second, I heard nothing. Then a calm voice whispered beside my ear. You weren't supposed to find this room until the next cycle. I recognized the voice immediately. It was mine. But this time, it wasn't coming from a copy. It was coming from something pretending to be one. I didn't move. Not because I was brave. Because I couldn't. The voice had come from less than a foot away. Close enough that I should have felt someone's breath. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence. Then, the basement lights came on by themselves. One after another. Not all at once. The room slowly revealed itself. And I realized something horrifying. The basement was much larger than it had been a few seconds earlier. When I'd walked down the stairs, I'd estimated it was about 20 feet across. Now, the shelves stretched so far into the darkness that I couldn't see the end of them. There weren't dozens of boxes. There were thousands. Every shelf carried the same style of label. A person's name, a date, a neighborhood. Some boxes looked ancient. Others had barely gathered dust. I walked between the rows. The silence was overwhelming. It felt less like a basement, and more like a library. Only instead of books, someone had cataloged lives. I stopped at one shelf. Every label shared the same surname. Different first names. Different decades. Different years. The dates stretched back nearly 200 years. None of them had lived at the same time. Yet every one of them had the exact same address. My address. I counted. There were 27 boxes. The 28th space sat empty. A small handwritten card rested there. Waiting. It already had my name written on it. The date underneath was blank. I backed away. No. I whispered. This isn't possible. A voice answered from somewhere among the shelves. It becomes possible when it happens often enough. I spun around. Nobody. The aisles remained empty. I continued walking. Eventually I reached a massive table covered with maps. Not one map. Hundreds. Each showed a different city, different country, different language. Yet every map contained the same symbol. A small black circle. Always placed beneath a neighborhood. Never in the middle of nowhere. Always where people had built homes, schools, churches, communities. It suddenly occurred to me, what if those places hadn't been chosen because people lived there? What if people had unknowingly built over something that was already there? Harold's notebook had said, it started here. He'd been wrong. It hadn't started at the farmhouse. The farmhouse had simply been the oldest place he knew. This was much older. A leather journal lay open on the table. Unlike Harold's notebook, this one wasn't handwritten by a frightened victim. It looked like a record kept by someone observing the phenomenon. The first page simply read, Cycle Observation Log. There was no author, only entries, thousands of them. I opened to the middle. Cycle 611. Subject remembered 14 consecutive nights. Unusual. Replacement successful. Memory degradation complete. Next entry. Cycle 948. Subject entered the hidden room too early. Archive expanded. Replacement delayed. Next. Cycle 1382. Subject attempted to destroy residence. Neighborhood corrected. No lasting effects. My hands trembled. These weren't stories. They were records. Somebody, or something, had been documenting this for centuries. I flipped farther. The page numbers continued climbing. 4,102, 9,841, 15,770. The oldest pages had become impossible to date. There were simply too many. Then I reached the final completed page. Cycle 28713. Subject, Omar. Status, remembering beyond expected threshold. Observation recommended. I stared at my own name. This wasn't prediction. It had already been written. The ink had dried long ago. I suddenly realized someone had expected me to read this. Slowly, I looked around the room. Who's writing these? Silence. Then, a single page turned by itself. No wind, no movement, just one page. Across the top were 4 words. You ask every time. I slammed the journal shut. The sound echoed through the endless room. Then, other sounds answered. Boxes opening. Not one. Hundreds. Cardboard lids lifting all at once. Soft, slow, methodical. I aimed my flashlight down the nearest aisle. One lid had fallen open. Inside wasn't paperwork. It wasn't photographs. It was clothing, folded neatly. A wallet, a wristwatch. Everything belonging to someone. Another box opened. Then another. And another. Dozens stood open, each containing the belongings of a different person. None contained a body. Just everything that proved they had once existed. Something brushed against my shoulder. I turned instantly. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps. Not approaching. Walking parallel to me. Hidden behind the shelves. Always staying exactly 1 aisle away. Whenever I turned, the footsteps stopped. Whenever I continued walking, they resumed. Someone was matching my pace. I reached the end of 1 aisle and turned the corner as quickly as I could. Empty. No one. But the next aisle over, the footsteps continued. Exactly beside me. Separated only by a wall of shelves. I broke into a run. The footsteps did too. I stopped suddenly. They stopped at the exact same moment. Not a fraction of a second later. Exactly. Like an echo that already knew what I would do. Then I noticed something on the floor. Fresh footprints. They weren't ahead of me. They weren't behind me. They appeared beside mine. Every time I took a step, another footprint appeared next to it. Invisible feet. Walking with me. Perfectly synchronized. I stared in disbelief. The footprints ended where I stopped. I slowly lifted 1 foot. Another invisible footprint appeared beside it. Whatever was walking next to me couldn't be seen, only tracked. The basement lights flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. The voice returned. Closer now. You finally noticed. I refused to answer. You've been walking together for years. Years. Not days. Not weeks. Years. The lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed the room. I reached for my flashlight. It wouldn't turn on. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then, I heard breathing. Not one person. Many. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Surrounding me from every direction. Slow. Patient. As though they'd all been waiting for the lights to go out. A match struck somewhere in the darkness. A tiny flame appeared. Someone was holding a candle. Then another flame appeared. Then another. Then another. One by one. The darkness filled with candlelight. Each candle illuminated a face. Every face was mine. Not copies standing together. Different ages. A child. A teenager. An old man. Versions of me I had never become. Versions of me I might still become. Hundreds of them stood silently between the shelves, each holding a candle and staring directly at me. None of them blinked. Finally, the oldest one stepped forward. His hair was completely white. His face was lined with age. But I recognized him immediately. He looked into my eyes with an expression that wasn't fear. It was pity. Then he spoke. "You're still looking for the beginning." He smiled weakly. The beginning was buried a very long time ago. He slowly raised one shaking hand and pointed, not deeper into the archive, but upward, toward the ceiling, toward the town above us. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. The houses were never built to keep them out. He paused. They were built to keep us in. The candles extinguished all at once. The basement plunged back into darkness, and somewhere above me, directly beneath my living room floor, I heard 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. They weren't coming from the basement. They were coming from inside my house. The knocking came again. 3 slow knocks. Not beneath the floor this time. From the front door. I climbed the basement stairs as quietly as I could. Every instinct told me not to answer. But something else, something that felt older than fear, kept pulling me toward the entrance. By the time I reached the hallway, the knocking had stopped. The house was silent. Too silent. The refrigerator wasn't humming. The air conditioner had stopped. Even the old wall clock in the kitchen no longer ticked. It felt as though the entire house was holding its breath. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. Only the empty porch. I unlocked the deadbolt but didn't open the door. Instead, I looked through the front window. Still nothing. The street was deserted. Then I noticed something that made my heart sink. Every house on the block had its front door open. Not wide open. Just enough to leave a narrow strip of darkness visible inside. Every single one. As if every family on the street had opened their doors at exactly the same moment. I stepped onto the porch. The air felt strangely heavy. No wind. No insects. No distant traffic. It was as though the town itself had gone quiet. Then I saw movement. One by one, people began stepping out of their homes. My neighbors. Melissa. The elderly couple across the street. The mailman. The teenager who jogged every morning. Dozens of familiar faces. None of them spoke. None of them looked frightened. They simply walked into the middle of the street and stood perfectly still, facing my house. I called out to Melissa. No response. She didn't even blink. Her eyes remained fixed on me. The others did the same. Hundreds of eyes. Not angry. Not hostile. Empty. Like people waiting for instructions. Then, almost together, they slowly raised one arm and pointed toward my house. Not at me. At the upstairs bedroom window. I turned. Someone was standing behind the curtain. A silhouette. Motionless. Watching us. Watching me. I knew the layout of my house. No one should have been upstairs. Not unless something had come out of the hidden room. Without thinking, I ran back inside. The front door slammed behind me. I rushed upstairs 2 steps at a time. The hallway seemed longer than ever. The mysterious door at the end stood wide open. Beyond it wasn't darkness anymore. It was another hallway, almost identical to mine. Same wallpaper, same family photographs, same wooden floor, except everything looked older, as though decades had passed without anyone living there. I stepped through. The temperature dropped immediately. Behind me, the doorway disappeared. I spun around. Only another stretch of hallway remained. There was no way back. Every room I opened looked familiar. My bedroom, my bathroom, my office. But each contained small differences. Photographs I didn't remember taking. Furniture I'd never owned. Books I'd never bought. It felt like walking through a life that almost belonged to me. Eventually I reached the living room. Someone was sitting in my favorite chair. He didn't look up immediately. He simply continued writing in a notebook. After several seconds, he closed it. Then he looked at me. He wasn't another copy. He wasn't older. He wasn't younger. He was exactly my age. Exactly as I looked that morning. Only one thing was different. His eyes. They were completely exhausted. Like someone who had accepted something impossible long ago. You made it farther than I expected, he said. His voice was calm. I've been waiting. I looked around the room. Where am I? My house. This is my house. He shook his head. It was. I pointed toward the notebook. What's that? He smiled. Your story. My stomach tightened. What? I've been writing everything you've done. He slid the notebook across the table. I opened it. The last page described exactly what had happened 5 minutes earlier. The neighbors. The front doors, the upstairs hallway, even my thoughts, word for word. I looked up. How is this possible? He leaned back. Because you're reading it. I frowned. That doesn't make any sense. It will. He walked toward the window. Outside, I expected to see my neighborhood, Instead, I saw hundreds. The same street repeated over and over in every direction. Rows of identical neighborhoods, each separated by empty fields, each containing the same style of houses, the same streetlights, the same quiet roads. Some looked modern, others belonged to different decades, but they all shared one detail. A single motionless figure stood somewhere on every street, waiting. "I spent years trying to escape," he said quietly. "I drove until the roads looped. I flew to another country. I even crossed an ocean." He laughed softly. "Every place eventually led back here. Why? Because this isn't a neighborhood." He turned toward me. "It's a system." Before I could ask what that meant, the grandfather clock in the hallway began chiming. 1, 2, 3, until it reached 28. The room shook. The lights dimmed. His expression changed instantly. "No," he whispered. "We're out of time." "What happens at 28? He looked directly into my eyes. For the first time in the entire conversation, he looked genuinely terrified. Then he said the words Harold had never lived long enough to write. "Tonight, one of us has to stay." The walls began to crack. The photographs fell from the walls. Somewhere deep inside the house, I heard doors opening. Not one, hundreds, followed by footsteps. Thousands of footsteps, walking toward us, slowly, patiently, as if whatever lived beyond those doors had finally been invited inside. The other version of me grabbed my arm. His hands were shaking. "Whatever happens next, don't believe the first thing that calls itself you." Before I could ask what he meant, someone behind me said, "You should listen to him." It was my voice. Again, I turned. Another version of me stood in the doorway, smiling. Then another appeared behind him. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the hallway was filled with dozens of identical versions of me. Some injured, some elderly, some wearing clothes from different decades. Every single one smiling. Every single one speaking together. "Welcome back." I couldn't count them. There were too many. Versions of me filled the hallway. Some looked only a few years older. Others looked decades older. One wore a military uniform. Another was dressed in a hospital gown. One limped. One had burns covering half his face. One looked no older than 16. Every version was different. Yet every pair of eyes held the same expression. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. As though they had all been expecting me. None of them moved. Not at first. They simply watched. Then the smiling version nearest the doorway spoke. "You always look confused." Another laughed quietly. "You said the same thing." A third pointed toward me. "He's still counting." Then they all began talking. Not over one another. Together. Like hundreds of voices reading the same sentence. "You think you're the original." The words echoed through the house. "You all do." The version standing beside me, the one who had warned me, grabbed my shoulder. "Don't answer them." I looked at him. "Who are they?" "They're the ones who stayed." "What does that mean?" He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly backed away, toward the living room, away from the hallway, away from them. His face had become pale. "They're almost awake." The smiling versions all turned their heads at exactly the same time. Not toward us, toward the ceiling, listening. I heard it too. Footsteps. Not inside the house. Above it, heavy, slow, walking across the roof. There was only one problem. The house had one story. There shouldn't have been anyone above us. Something scraped across the ceiling. Long, deliberate, dragging sounds. The smiling versions lowered their heads, almost respectfully. Then one by one, they stepped aside, creating a path through the hallway. Not for us, for something else. Something approaching from the darkness beyond them. I finally saw movement. Not a person. A shadow. It was too tall for the hallway. Yet it continued walking without bending, without touching the ceiling. Reality simply stretched around it. Its outline refused to stay the same. Sometimes it looked impossibly thin, sometimes impossibly wide. Looking directly at it made my eyes ache. I instinctively looked away. The older version beside me whispered, "Don't try to understand its shape. Your brain will invent one." The shadow stopped about 20 feet away. None of the copies looked at me anymore. They were all looking at it, waiting. Then, for the first time, it spoke. Its voice wasn't loud. It wasn't deep. It wasn't even frightening. It sounded like every familiar voice I'd ever heard layered together. My father's voice, my mother's, my teacher's, friends, my own. Thousands of voices speaking as one. "You remember too much." The words weren't threatening. They sounded disappointed. I forced myself to answer, "What are you?" Silence. Then the copies all smiled wider. The thing answered, "The question changes. You never do." The version beside me whispered, "It never gives names. Only answers to questions you've already asked." I kept staring. "What do you want?" The shadow remained perfectly still. Finally, it answered, "What I have always wanted. You." The room shook violently. Frames crashed from the walls. The windows cracked. The floor beneath us trembled. The smiling versions didn't move. They simply continued watching, as though this happened every cycle, because probably had. The notebook lying on the coffee table suddenly opened by itself. Pages began turning faster and faster. Ink appeared across blank paper. New sentences writing themselves. I rushed over. The final page was still unfinished. The words continued appearing as I watched. He finally reached the truth. He finally asked the right question. He finally understands why he keeps returning. I turned the page. Blank. Another page. Blank. Then, the final sentence appeared. "Now choose." "Choose what?" I shouted. No one answered. Instead, every copy took one step forward, perfectly synchronized. Then another, and another, closing the distance between us. The version beside me suddenly shoved me backward. "Run." I stumbled into the living room as the copies rushed past him. Not running, walking, calmly. Hundreds of identical footsteps filled the hallway. The version who had protected me turned toward them. "I'll hold them." "You can't." He smiled sadly. "I already did." Before I could react, he slammed the living room door shut. The lock clicked. Immediately the pounding began. Not frantic, steady. Hundreds of hands striking the wood in perfect rhythm. I searched desperately for another exit. The windows wouldn't open. The back door had vanished. The room itself was changing, growing larger. Bookshelves appeared where blank walls had been. Furniture shifted. The house was rearranging itself. Then I noticed one object that hadn't been there before. An old wooden desk. Resting on it was a single photograph. It showed a family standing outside a newly built home. The date read, April 18th, 1891. The address was mine. But the house looked completely different. Smaller, older, standing alone in an empty field. I looked closer. The family smiled proudly at the camera. Behind them, already standing in exactly the same place where my bedroom would someday be, was the figure. Motionless, watching, waiting, even before the first family moved in. On the back of the photograph someone had written, "The first house wasn't built because of the figure. It was built because someone opened the door." A cold realization spread through me. The figure outside had never been approaching. It had been guarding the place where the door first appeared. Every generation, someone opened it again. Every cycle, another copy was made. The thing outside the houses wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to make sure nothing else got out. The pounding on the living room door suddenly stopped. Complete silence. Then, very softly, the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob turned slowly, not with force, not like someone trying to break in. It turned gently, patiently, as if whoever stood on the other side already knew the door would open eventually. The lock clicked, the handle lowered. Then, nothing. The door remained closed. Whoever or whatever was outside simply waited. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The room was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat. Then came 3 soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Exactly the same rhythm that had followed me since the first night. A voice spoke through the wood. You've almost remembered. Not almost understood. Not almost escaped. Remembered. The photograph of the first house was still in my hand. I looked at it again. The family smiled proudly in front of their new home. Behind them stood the silent figure. The date read 1891, but something caught my attention. A corner of the photograph had been folded over. I unfolded it carefully. There was more of the picture hidden beneath. The house wasn't the first structure built there. Behind it, barely visible beneath the fresh lumber, was the stone foundation of something much older. A circular structure, almost like the remains of a tower. Well, the older version of me had said, the beginning was buried, not destroyed, buried. The first family hadn't built their house on empty land. They had built it over something they wanted covered, something they didn't understand. The voice behind the door spoke again. You're asking the right questions. I forced myself to answer. What was buried? Silence. Then, a memory appeared. Not a vision. A memory. One that wasn't mine. I was standing in an open field. No roads. No houses. Only tall grass moving in the wind. Dozens of people surrounded a massive stone pit in the ground. Some prayed. Some cried. Others argued. No one wanted to get closer. Inside the pit stood the same motionless figure, watching them. It had no face, no movement, no weapon. It simply stood there, day after day, year after year. It never ate, never slept, never moved. People began building around it. First a wooden fence, then a small chapel. When that failed, they built a stone tower. Years later, the tower became a farmhouse, then another building. Eventually, an entire neighborhood. Generation after generation kept adding walls. Not to imprison the figure, to stop curious people from climbing down into the pit. The memory vanished. I found myself back in the living room. The voice whispered, it was never a prison. It was a warning. The front door opened by itself. No wind, no footsteps. The motionless figure stood on my porch, closer than it had ever been. For the first time, I could see details. Its clothes weren't black. They had once been white, covered in centuries of dirt. Its skin looked like cracked stone, not flesh. Its hands hung motionless at its sides. Its face was still impossible to see. Every time I tried to focus on it, my eyes drifted somewhere else, as though my mind refused to process what was there. It didn't enter. It simply stood on the porch, waiting. Behind it, every neighbor remained frozen in the street, still pointing toward my house. Not one of them blinked. Not one of them breathed. Time itself seemed suspended. The thing finally lifted one hand. Not toward me, toward the photograph. I looked down. Words were appearing across the back. Not ink. The paper itself was changing. Red. They opened the pit. They could not close it, so they built above it. But buildings decay. Memories decay. The door always returns. A loud crash echoed from somewhere beneath the house. The basement. Then another. And another. Like enormous stones breaking apart underground. The floor shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The old house groaned. Whatever had been buried was moving. The figure lowered its hand. Then, for the first time, moved. One step. Not toward me. Past me. into the house. I instinctively backed away. It crossed the hallway without making a sound, without disturbing the floorboards. It walked straight toward the hidden room. The same room every copy had feared. The same room that had created them. The figure stopped at the doorway. Then, it knelt, slowly, respectfully, like a guard returning to its post. Only then did I realize something impossible. It wasn't protecting us from what was outside. It was protecting us from what was inside the room. The entire house shook violently. A deafening crack echoed beneath the floor. The hidden hallway split down the middle. The wallpaper peeled away. The wooden walls crumbled like old paper. Behind them, there was no house, no framework, no insulation. Only endless stone descending into darkness. The hidden room had never been inside my home. My home had been built around it, just like every house before it. Far below, I finally saw the bottom. A circular chamber, exactly like the memory. In its center stood an enormous stone ring, covered in symbols older than any language I recognized. The ring wasn't lying flat. It stood upright, like a doorway, except there was no wall around it, only empty air inside, black, darker than night. Something moved within that darkness, not walking, watching, waiting. Then a hand emerged. It wasn't human. It had too many joints, too many fingers. It gripped the edge of the stone ring. Then another hand appeared. Slowly, something began pulling itself through. The silent figure beside me bowed its head, not in fear, in resignation, as though it had held the door closed for centuries, and finally knew it couldn't hold it any longer. The thing climbing through the ring spoke before its face appeared. Its voice wasn't terrifying. It was familiar, calm, gentle, almost comforting. It said only one sentence. You finally remembered where you came from. The hand pulled itself farther through the stone ring. It wasn't large. It wasn't monstrous. If anything, its proportions looked almost human. That somehow made it worse. Its fingers were too long. Its joints bent in ways they shouldn't. Its skin wasn't pale. It wasn't any color at all. It looked like something my eyes refused to focus on. Every time I thought I'd seen it clearly, I immediately forgot what it looked like. Almost as if my mind erased the image before I could understand it. The silent figure remained kneeling. It never looked up. It never tried to stop the thing emerging from the doorway. Instead, it slowly reached toward the floor. There, buried beneath centuries of dust, lay an old iron chain. The figure wrapped the chain around its own wrists, then around its ankles. Only then did I understand. It hadn't been imprisoned. It had chosen to stay. The voice behind me spoke. Not the thing in the doorway. The older version of me. The first keeper. I turned. Every copy had gathered behind us. None of them were smiling anymore. They looked exhausted, heartbroken. One by one, they stepped forward. Not toward me, toward the kneeling figure. Each bowed their head, like mourners at a funeral. What is happening? No one answered immediately. Finally, the oldest version of me spoke. The keeper is dying. I looked back. The figure hadn't moved, yet cracks had begun spreading across its skin. Thin lines at first, then wider. Stone breaking apart. Dust drifting into the endless pit below. It had stood there for centuries. Now, it was falling apart. It can't hold the door anymore. The words echoed through the chamber. I looked toward the stone ring. The thing emerging had pulled itself halfway through. Still no face. Still no features I could understand. Only movement. Slow. Patient. Like someone who had waited so long that another few minutes meant nothing. I turned to the oldest copy. Tell me what it is. He shook his head. I've asked that question hundreds of times. And? It changes the answer every cycle. So you don't know? He smiled sadly. I know one thing. It isn't evil. That answer stunned me. What? It isn't good either. He looked toward the door. It simply exists. He picked up an old stone from the floor, held it in his hand. When rain falls, is the rain evil? No. When the ocean rises, is the ocean evil? No. When a black hole destroys a star, does it hate the star? I slowly shook my head. It doesn't. It simply follows its nature. He looked directly into my eyes. So does this. I finally understood why every explanation had failed. This wasn't a demon. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't hunting people. Human beings simply didn't understand what it was. The way ants don't understand highways, or fish don't understand airplanes. We had spent centuries giving it names because our brains couldn't accept something without one. So why the copies? The oldest version sighed. Because memory, he paused, is the lock. I frowned. What? He walked toward the stone ring. The door doesn't open because someone touches it. It opens when someone remembers it. I stared. Every cycle. One person remembers too much. The door opens wider. So you erase memories. He nodded. The neighborhood. The changing photographs. The disappearing histories. They aren't accidents. They're repairs. My stomach turned. The neighborhood is trying to protect itself. No, he corrected me quietly. We are. He pointed toward every copy standing behind him. We're the repairs. I looked around. Dozens. Hundreds. Every version of me. Every cycle. Every failed attempt. Every memory that had been removed. They hadn't been created. They had been separated. Pieces of one life. Fragments of one mind. You aren't seeing copies. He spoke softly. You're seeing everything you've forgotten. I couldn't breathe. The little boy. The old man. The injured soldier. The teenager. The exhausted version I'd chased. They weren't alternate timelines. They were memories. Entire lives. Entire versions of myself that had been cut away every time the door began opening. Not separate people. Pieces of me. 1,000 forgotten moments crashed into my mind at once. Birthdays. Friends whose names I'd forgotten. Places I'd visited. Conversations. Entire years. The weight of decades flooded back into me. I collapsed to my knees. Every forgotten memory returned all at once. It felt like drowning. The thing inside the door laughed. Not loudly. Softly. Almost kindly. I wondered how long it would take. Its voice had changed again. Now, it sounded exactly like mine. Not because it was copying me. Because I'd been copying it. The keeper suddenly raised its head. For the first time, it looked directly at me. And I finally saw its face. It wasn't blank. It wasn't hidden. It was impossible. Every person who had ever stood watch before the door was carved into its skin. Thousands of faces, layered over one another. Some old, some young, some crying, some smiling, all occupying the same face at once. Every keeper, every generation, every sacrifice. It had never been one being. It had been all of them. The cracks spread faster. Its stone body began breaking apart. Chunks fell into the abyss. The ancient chain snapped. One link at a time. The oldest version of me closed his eyes. It's time. I looked at him. For what? He smiled. For someone to remember. Before I could react, every version of me stepped forward together. They weren't walking toward the door. They were walking toward me. One by one, they touched my shoulder. The teenager, the old man, the burned one, the soldier, the child. Each touch brought back another lifetime, another cycle, another failure. Thousands of years of memories poured into my mind. I remembered building the first wooden fence. I remembered laying the stones of the tower. I remembered becoming a monk, a farmer, a carpenter, a police officer, a schoolteacher, a father. I remembered every life that had stood between the door and the world. Not reincarnation, duty, the same consciousness, passed from keeper to keeper, erasing itself each time so the burden could be carried again. I wasn't the first. I wasn't the 100th. I wasn't even the 1,000th. I had stood before the door, more times than history itself remembered. The final memory returned. The very first one. A voice asking me a single question. Before the first stone had ever been laid. Will you stand here until someone remembers why? I remembered my answer. I will. The stone ring behind me groaned. The thing emerging smiled, because it knew. I had finally remembered the promise I'd made. The memory didn't fade. It stayed. For the first time since this nightmare began, nothing disappeared. Nothing was rewritten. Every forgotten life remained inside me. I remembered every keeper, every failure, every sacrifice. The weight of thousands of lifetimes settled into my mind. I finally understood why no keeper had ever escaped. It wasn't because the door trapped them. It was because every keeper had made the same choice. Knowingly, the thing standing inside the stone ring watched me. It hadn't crossed completely. It couldn't. Not yet. Its body ended at the waist, disappearing into the impossible darkness beyond the ring. It tilted its head. You remember? I nodded. I do. Then you remember me? I remember what you are. It remained silent. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, it asked, "Then tell me." I looked directly into the darkness inside the ring. For the first time, I wasn't afraid. You are the opening. The chamber became perfectly still. Even the falling dust froze in the air. The entity smiled, not because I had solved the puzzle, because I had finally stopped asking the wrong question. You are not a creature. You are not a god. You are not a demon. You are. I struggled to find words that could describe something no language had been built to explain. Possibility. The entity slowly closed its eyes. Centuries ago, human beings had discovered something beneath the earth. Not a monster. Not a prison. A place where reality itself had become unfinished. A wound. A tear. A point where every possible version of existence touched. A door. Not leading somewhere else, but leading to every place at once. Every life. Every choice. Every version of every person that could ever exist. If the door ever opened completely, those possibilities wouldn't stay separated. Everything would exist at once. Every history. Every future. Every decision. The universe wouldn't explode. It would lose the ability to decide what had happened. Reality itself would become memory, and memory could no longer choose what was real. The first people who found it didn't understand. They simply noticed that everyone who looked inside began remembering lives they had never lived. Families changed overnight. Children recognized parents they had never met. Languages mixed together. Entire villages woke up remembering different histories. Some remembered wars that had never happened. Others remembered continents with different names. The world was unraveling. Not because something escaped, because people remembered too much. Then someone made the first sacrifice. Not by dying, by forgetting. One person volunteered to stand between humanity and the door. Every memory the door tried to return passed into that one keeper instead of everyone else. The keeper remembered everything, so the rest of humanity could remember only one life. The first keeper stood there for 43 years. When he could no longer endure the weight of countless realities, another took his place, then another, then another. Kingdoms rose, empires collapsed, religions formed, languages evolved. Still, someone remained at the door. History forgot them. The door never did. I looked at the silent stone figure beside the ring. It wasn't a statue. It was the remains of the last keeper. Century after century, their body had slowly become stone. Not through magic, through time. The chain wasn't there to imprison them. It was there to remind them they had chosen to stay. The entity spoke again. I never asked. I only waited. I nodded. I know. Every story had been wrong. The door never demanded a sacrifice. Humanity offered one. Again, and again, and again. Behind me, every version of myself stood silently, no longer smiling, no longer frightened, simply waiting. The oldest one stepped forward. We carried what you couldn't. The child smiled, so you could still laugh. The soldier nodded, so you could still sleep. The exhausted version I had chased through the neighborhood finally spoke. I carried the memories of everyone we lost. Tears filled my eyes. They weren't copies. They were burdens, separated from me one piece at a time. so no single mind would collapse beneath the weight. The entity extended one hand, not threatening, not commanding, simply offering. The choice remains. I looked into the darkness beyond the door. Infinite worlds flickered inside. I saw civilizations humanity had never built. Versions of Earth where history had turned differently. People I had loved and lives I had forgotten. Children I had raised. Friends I had buried. Entire existences waiting just beyond the threshold. I understood why people walked toward the door. Not because they were controlled. Because everyone longs to know what might have been. Then I heard another sound. Footsteps. Coming from above. Hundreds. Thousands. The townspeople. Every person living above us. The neighborhoods. The cities. The world. The door was opening wider. They were beginning to remember. The process had already started. The oldest keeper looked at me. If no one stands watch. You already know. I did. Every life would become every other life. No one would know which memories belonged to them. Identity itself would dissolve. There would be no death. No war. No peace. Only endless confusion. Humanity would survive. But no one would remain themselves. I walked toward the stone ring. The entity stepped aside. It never tried to stop me. Never tried to convince me. It simply made room. The ancient chains lay broken at the feet of the old keeper. I picked them up. They were heavier than iron had any right to be. As I wrapped them around my wrist, every version of me began to fade. Not disappearing. Returning. One by one. They walked into me. The child. The old man. The soldier. The frightened teenager. The exhausted survivor. Every forgotten memory. Every abandoned life. Every keeper. They all became one again. The weight was unbearable. Yet, for the first time, I was whole. The stone beneath my feet began changing. The chamber repaired itself. The broken walls sealed. The ancient symbols glowed once more. Above me, I heard houses shifting. Foundations settling. The neighborhood rebuilding itself. The system was closing. The door was healing. The entity looked at me one final time. Not with hatred. Not with gratitude. Only understanding. Then it slowly stepped backward into the darkness beyond the ring. Its final words echoed through the chamber. We will meet. When you are remembered. The darkness sealed shut. The stone ring became solid. Silent. Still. For the first time in centuries. There was no voice. No whispers. No footsteps. Only silence. I took my place before the door. The chains tightened. I closed my eyes. Above me, life continued. Children laughed. Cars passed. Dogs barked. People argued over meaningless things. None of them knew. None of them ever would. And that was the point. I don't know how much time has passed. Maybe days. Maybe centuries. Time doesn't exist here the way it does above. I no longer grow hungry. I no longer sleep. The door doesn't allow either. It only allows memory. Sometimes I remember lives that never happened. Sometimes I forget the one I'm living. That's why every keeper writes. Not to leave instructions. To remember who they are. The first year was the hardest. I could hear everything above me. Footsteps. Rain striking the roof. Children laughing in the backyard. Birthdays. Arguments. Dogs barking at nothing in the middle of the night. Life continued only a few feet above my head. I could hear it all. I could never join it. Eventually, the sounds became memories. Then, even the memories faded. The neighborhood changed. The old houses were demolished. New ones were built. Families came and went. Trees grew. Roads were widened. Streetlights were replaced. Governments changed. Wars began and ended. Technology advanced. People carried little glowing screens everywhere. The world transformed. The door remained exactly the same. At some point, I stopped counting the years. The only thing that still mattered was 3:13 a.m. Every night, without fail, someone would wake up. Someone would look out a window. Someone would notice a figure standing outside. Most people closed the curtains. Some convinced themselves it was a dream. A few called the police. None of that mattered. The cycle had already begun. The figure they saw wasn't hunting them. It was me. Not the man I used to be. Not anymore. The keeper. The stone had slowly climbed my arms, across my chest, my neck. My skin had become rough, cracked, heavy. The face I once recognized had disappeared beneath centuries of weathered stone. From outside, I looked exactly like the silent figure that had watched me on my first night, because I was. Every keeper eventually becomes the watcher. When one finally turns to stone, another takes their place below. The cycle continues. Not because the door demands it, because someone always chooses. Sometimes, someone remembers too much. Those are the dangerous ones. People who ask questions. People who refuse to accept impossible answers. People like me. When that happens, I leave the door. Only for a few nights. I stand outside their home. One house farther away each night. Never closer than necessary. Not to frighten them. To warn them. To give them time to stop searching. Most do. Some don't. The ones who don't always find the door. Just as I did. I tried everything. I appeared in daylight once. A child saw me. He waved. His mother looked where he pointed. She saw nothing. Children always see us. Adults remember just enough to forget. The years continued. More keepers came. Each believed they were the first. Each believed they could end the cycle. Each eventually remembered the truth. None of them were forced to stay. Every single one chose. Because once you understand what waits beyond the door, walking away stops being possible. If you're wondering whether anyone has ever escaped, the answer is yes. Once. Long before I became the keeper. Someone chose to leave. They walked away. They never looked back. For exactly 13 minutes. Then every person in 3 nearby villages simultaneously remembered different lives. Families no longer recognized one another. Children called strangers mom. Languages changed overnight. History fractured. By sunrise, another keeper had volunteered. No one has walked away since. Sometimes I wonder what became of my old life. Did anyone notice I was gone? Did they search? Did they grieve? Or did the neighborhood repair itself again, removing every trace that I had ever existed? I honestly don't know. Maybe there are photographs of a family with one person missing. Maybe my friends remember someone they can't quite picture. Maybe my name exists in an old notebook buried beneath another house. Eventually, even those thoughts fade. If you've listened this far, there's one final thing you should know. This story wasn't written after it happened. It wasn't recorded from memory. It's being told while I'm still standing here. Right now. At this very moment. The only reason you can hear my voice is because for a few minutes, someone else is watching the door. That means one thing. The cycle has started again. If you've dismissed everything I've said, I hope you're right. I truly do. But tonight, before you go to bed, wake up at exactly 3:13 a.m. Don't set an alarm. If you wake naturally, walk to your window. Don't turn on the lights. Just look outside. If the street is empty, go back to sleep. Forget this story. Live your life. But if you see someone standing perfectly still, don't panic. Don't wave. Don't call out. And whatever you do, don't spend the next 28 nights trying to understand why they're there. Because that's exactly what I did. And now, I'm standing outside someone else's window, waiting to see if they make the same mistake. If you happen to look outside tonight, and you see me, I want you to remember one thing. I'm not the thing you should be afraid of. I'm the last thing, standing between you and whatever is still waiting behind the door. Thanks for staying with me until the very end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel reach more people who love slow burn psychological horror like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do. There are many more original horror stories on the way, and you won't want to miss the next nightmare. Now before you leave, tonight if you happen to wake up around 3:13 a.m., don't check your phone first. Walk to your window. Turn off the lights. Look outside. If the street is empty, forget you ever heard this story. But if someone is standing perfectly still, watching your house, close the curtains. Go back to bed. And whatever you do, Don't try to find out why. Because every keeper started with the same mistake. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next story.